Chamberlain. I'm president of the Middle East Institute, and I'd like to give you all a very warm welcome. We're in for a real treat this afternoon. Christine Fair will talk about her most recent book, Fighting to the End, Pakistan's Army's Way of War. She will remain after her talk. She'll talk, have question and answer period, and then she will be available to sell some of her books for $20 each after the talk is over. You know, with so much attention this week riveted on the horrific reports of the Islamic State and the inhumanity of the Islamic State, a lot of our press is overlooking the evolving crisis in Pakistan. Now, as Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is facing massive protests, not just from one, but from two different sources, Imran Khan and the PTI, and Sufi cleric Tahir al-Qadri. So the news there is very interesting. And of course, as always in Pakistan, the hand of the military is rumored to be behind both sets of protests. To really understand Pakistan, and I can see many of you in the audience who do understand Pakistan, you know that you have to understand the Pakistan military. And that is why Christine's book is so important, so timely. It's a superb book. I recommend that you all buy it afterwards and read it. But you know, it's not her first book. And it won't be her last book. She's got 3 other books she's thinking of working on. But the first book that I read of Christine Fair, I love it, and I want you to go online to Amazon and buy it. It's not about Pakistan. It's a cookbook. It's called Cuisines of the Axis of Evil, and the commentary is hilarious, and the recipes are kitchen tested, and my daughters and I love this book. I'm going to get her to sign this one when she gets a minute. I'll get her to sign it now to China, Jade, and Wendy. Or my 2 daughters, because we all like it very much. When you're online, and don't do it now, but when after this is over and you are online, go to the Middle East Institute's website too and sign up for our September 12 full-day conference on Egypt. We're going to hold it at the Park Hyatt from, I think it's 10 to 4:30, something like that. We offer it free, as we often offer everything free to our members and audiences, so please do come. Nabil Fahmy, former ambassador here, former foreign minister in Egypt, will be a keynote speaker, as will Ambassador and currently Assistant Secretary for NEA Ann Patterson. We've got a lineup to die for from Egypt. We're flying in from Egypt, including the first female head of a party, the Al-Noor Party. So come to that. And sign up quickly, because as many of our events at the Middle East Institute, they get oversubscribed, and we have to cut them off quite early, as this event is. But for those of you who are crowded into our very small conference room here, I have some good news, because shortly, in a couple of months, we're going to be blasting out those walls and a renovation project. Yes, and a renovation project, and we're going to extend the conference room all the way back to the end. And by this time next year, we'll be able to fit 130 people into our conference room to listen to Christine Fair talk about her next book. So I know a lot of you are supporters of the Middle East Institute. If you'd like to support that project, we'd very much welcome it. And you can talk to us about making a donation. Christine, have at it.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this really unseasonably lovely day. I mean, this should be a day we should all be out having cocktails or something, enjoying this day. I'm game. Rob Roy's. Also, thank you for mentioning the cookbook. That cookbook, it is a real cookbook. Don't drink and blend is what I tell my students. I cut this finger off working on the Iraq chapter. It manicures very nicely, but it took a lot of stitches. But the origins of this, like my brothers, they were deployed to Iraq, and that sucked a lot, because if you were an opponent of the Iraq War, you were not considered a patriot, which I look back on. I need to just get mental floss. So a bunch of us out in LA, we started doing the Axis of Evil dinner parties where we just, they were my only family, so the thought of them getting killed or even killing in Iraq was devastating. So that was born out of my brother's deployment and the meals that we cooked while they were away. The irony is my brothers won't touch any food that I make. If it's not like from Carl's Jr., it's just not something they're going to eat. So it's a little bit heartbreaking and ironic. But this book is on the Pakistan Army. One point of interest, the cover, I want to give a shout out to the artist, Isaira Wasim. A lot of her artwork speaks to the themes of civil military affairs in Pakistan. Some of the best pictures actually of Lashkar-e-Taiba and its key terrorist acolytes are actually done by her. So she let me use this artwork absolutely free. And I will tell you, there's no way I could actually afford this picture. I think this picture sells for like $10,000. So definitely want to give a thanks to Isaira Wasim, and I encourage you to check her out. So the other thing I'll point out, because this sort of is an additional data point that sort of underscores the argument of my book, the Pakistan Army was very upset by this cover, and the Oxford University Press Pakistan version cannot use this cover. So if you buy this book in India or Bangladesh, it has this little thing for sale everywhere in South Asia except Pakistan, because apparently Musharraf's feelings were hurt because he's in flip-flops on a carousel. So data point X to the arguments I make in the book. So my question is, so by way of a background, I'm not a political scientist. I did my PhD in South Asian area studies, which means I did languages, and text to me are really important. But as I began approaching this question, I realized it's a question that political scientists ask. And I want to point out a few other books that have come out of late. One is written by Akil Shah, and the other is written by T.V. Paul. And what's actually encouraging is that we ask very similar questions, but we use very different data and different styles of argumentation, and we kind of come to the same point. So the equifinality of our different arguments, I think, is really quite interesting. So my question that has been really eating at me for a number of years is what explains Pakistan's persistent revisionism? And what I mean by that is the following. For a number of historical reasons that I detail in the book, Pakistan has been obsessed, and I don't say regaining Kashmir, because Kashmir was never Pakistan's to have, but it's been obsessed with seizing all of Kashmir, particularly that part that's under control by India. And to do so, it's launched 3 wars in 47-48, and anyone doubts that that was a Pakistan-led affair, I encourage you to read Shuja Nawaz's piece on this in India Review, which was published in 2008. He marshals very compelling evidence that demonstrates the level of state support that the Pakistan state gave the so-called tribal marauders that were the first combatants to enter the Kashmir theater. The second war it launched to get Kashmir from India was in 1965 and again in 1999. And in addition to that, it has waged with varying intensity an asymmetric conflict over Kashmir since 1947, not 1990, 1947. I'm happy to talk about that. In fact, I will later in my remarks. Now, what's also interesting about this strategy is that it's never worked, and it's going to be increasingly likely to not work in the future. Not only that, the strategies that the Pakistani state has developed to prosecute this agenda have really put the state in a very tough bind. Its primary tools are, as I'll talk about, jihad under the nuclear umbrella. And if you're following Operation Eyewash, what the Pakistanis will call Operation Zarb-e-Azab, they will tell you that they are in the battle to take out the Pakistani Taliban. What they don't like to tell you is that there'd be no Pakistan Taliban had there been no Jaish-e-Mohammed, had there been no Afghan Taliban, had there been no Harkat-ul-Jihad Islami. In other words, the very Islamist militant organizations that the Pakistani state has cultivated, developed, and deployed to prosecute its external agenda. So this is in ordinary parlance called blowback, and blowback is never kind. So not only are these strategies failing to achieve even modest parts of Pakistan's goals, I think we could agree that they're even imperiling the viability of the state itself. Pakistan has enjoyed great international scorn and scrutiny because of its continued reliance upon these jihadists' proxies, and also because of its history of nuclear weapons, which is well documented and not terribly salutary. So what political scientists would say, we expect states to modify their strategies when they fail to attain the state's objectives, much less imperil the state itself. To an ordinary person, who's not a political scientist, i.e. me, I put it a different way. If my 14-year-old niece and her friends were playing a game called Pakistan and India with rules that we all recognize to represent win and fail, the person who drew the Pakistan card would have just given up after 5 minutes because they would have realized that this is a losing game to be playing if you're on the Pakistan side. Yet GHQ hasn't figured this out in 65 years. So what's going on? What explains Pakistan's resistance to changing the way it thinks about India? And in the conduct of the research that I'm going to explain in a few minutes, I actually found that not only is Pakistan's revisionism staunch as ever towards Kashmir, it's also widening in the sense that from the 1970s, long before any Indian strategy thought about India's use of hard power, Pakistani strategists began talking about India as a hegemon and positing Pakistan is the only state in the region that can resist India's rise. So not only is Pakistan's revisionism retrenched on Kashmir, it's also expanding in that Pakistan sees as itself the only state that can resist India's uneven but inevitable rise. The conventional wisdom for why Pakistan does what it does is that Pakistan is a security-seeking state. And I think, lots of folks in this room have served in Pakistan and have been in charge of the ways in which we engage them, and I'm always interested to hear what they think about this. But when I look at this as a non-government person, what seems to me is that this idea that Pakistan's a security-seeking state seems to animate much of what we do and what we have done. So in other words, there's some amount of F-16s, some amount of foreign military assistance, some amount of economic assistance, where we can, on the margin, make Pakistan feel secure vis-a-vis India. Maybe it's some little diplomatic fruiting about the margins. And if Pakistan can feel secure with India, it can put down the jihadi assets in Kashmir. And as a positive externality, it stops messing around in Afghanistan, under the assumption that Pakistan's primary concerns in Afghanistan derive from India. Now, every once in a while, i.e. whenever we have a new competitor for the leader of the free world, this comes again into play. So we saw this with Barack Obama when he was a candidate. Kashmir is the most dangerous place in the world. And remember, he wanted to appoint a special representative for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And India said, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, we will not give this person a visa. And then suddenly that idea fell away, and what we had was the SRAP, the Special Representative for Afghanistan and India. But that moment in the Barack Obama campaign was not unique. And we saw this actually with Colin Powell. Colin Powell was very interested in resolving the Kashmir issue. And so this would animate concepts of what I'll call a grand bargain. By the way, Ahmed Rashid and Barnett Rubin wrote a piece, actually several pieces about a grand bargain. And of course, Barnett Rubin played an important role in terms of advising the SRAP. And this grand bargain was that the U.S. should pull out its magical diplomatic wand, resolve the Kashmir issue, and then, by extension, solve Afghanistan. Now, I argue in the book that this is actually a very dangerous way of thinking. It's a dangerous way of thinking for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it shows a complete ignorance of how the Kashmir dispute emerged and evolved in the first place. And I'm happy, there's usually some Pakistani at this point. The plebiscite. Well, let me talk about the plebiscite. UN Security Council Resolution 48 had 3 conditions that culminated in the plebiscite. Never ever met a Pakistani who can cite the 3 conditions. First condition was that Pakistan had to demilitarize Kashmir to the satisfaction of a body appointed by the UN that was never formed because Pakistan never did that first thing. The second thing was that India was to demilitarize, however, was permitted to keep a defensive position, again, subject to the satisfaction of this non-appointed UN body. And when those 2 things occurred in sequence, i.e. necessarily, but contingent upon the previous, then this plebiscite was to be held. So when Pakistanis holler about the plebiscite, what they really should be doing is holding their own government to account, because not only did they weren't fond of the plebiscite idea in the first place, but conditioned upon accepting this, they didn't fulfill that first obligation. So when you actually go through the history of the Kashmir issue, Pakistan doesn't really have a very good case to make. Right? There is an instrument of accession, and if Pakistan wants to reject that instrument of accession, well, we can talk about the Khan of Kalat's instrument of accession, right? In fact, neither India nor Pakistan have very good arguments to make on the basis of instruments of accession. But nonetheless, when the United States every 4 to 8 years resuscitates the idea of Kashmir being the most dangerous place, we're basically treating India and Pakistan as equal, when in fact Pakistan has been using asymmetric strategies, i.e. terrorism under its nuclear umbrella, to try to coerce India. I think most of us would recognize that acquiescing to nuclear terrorist coercion is not something that's very good. So I make a very large argument that we really need to rethink this idea that Pakistan's a security-seeking state. And I go to this Kashmir point because what's interesting, the Pakistanis, particularly the army, and I'll talk about my data in a minute for this, they don't make an argument about Kashmir in terms of security. They could, right? They could make a water security argument, but in 6 decades of their military literature that I review, not a single argument is made. Instead, they make their arguments around Kashmir in ideological terms. It's really important. They make their argument based upon the two-nation theory, that India does not accept us as a Muslim country, again, going back to the two-nation theory. And so this is not the kind of argumentation that you expect from a security-seeking state. So, in fact, I claim that the reason for this is that Pakistan's not a security-seeking state, that Pakistan's insecurity doesn't explain most of what Pakistan does. And instead, I rely upon the work of Charlie Glazer, who is now here in DC at GW, but previously he was at the University of Chicago. And he talks about this concept of security-seeking states versus purely ideological / greedy states. And it's worth reading to you what he says about ideological, greedy states, because it sounds pretty much like Pakistan to me. Greedy states are those that are fundamentally dissatisfied with the status quo, desiring additional territory even when it's not required for security. Purely greedy states pursue revisionism to increase prestige, spread ideology, and/or propagate their religious worldview. Greedy states use competition as the only or primary means to achieve these non-security goals. And what he finds in his work, that when you treat a security-seeking state, an ideological greedy state, like a security-seeking state through appeasement strategies, and I think it's fair to characterize what we do with Pakistan is aspects of appeasement, that you actually encourage this behavior. And so the argument that I advance in the book is that we need to stop thinking of Pakistan as a security-seeking state. And we need to realize that these appeasement strategies that really have formed the core of U.S. engagement with Pakistan actually encourages Pakistan to do things that are injurious to our interests. Now, let me give you an example, by the way. Let's just pretend that you were the army chief for, I don't know, army chiefs from the period of 2002 to 2011, when you were taking American money, allegedly as an ally in the war on terror, giving that to the Taliban, who are killing our troops. And what was America's response to this? Well, gee, where is my checkbook? Let me write an ever larger check. I mean, it's almost risible. My brothers are in uniform, so I take this very, very personally. So what was the consequence for bin Laden rolling up in Abbottabad? The Pakistanis, not only have they not caught anyone associated with harboring him, the only dude they did arrest was this poor schmuck that was involved in actually trying to catch bin Laden. So what price has it paid for its behavior? Absolutely none. So one of the things that sort of runs through my book is that we have to stop treating Pakistan as a state that can be helped by these policies of appeasement, that in fact we're basically enabling Pakistan. If we were at a dinner party, I would call this methadone treatment, but we're not actually treating the underlying problem that Pakistan has. So let me talk a little bit about my data. So as some of you know, I'm blacklisted now and I can't go back. So the Pakistan Army will not have the opportunity to lie to me anymore in theater. But that's a whole other side discussion. So my primary data, although I've met many Pakistan military personnel over the decades I've been working in Pakistan, I want to draw one really important observation about those interactions. And by the way, I think one of the best books about this is written by Tazy and Howard Schaefer called Riding the Roller Coaster, How Pakistan Negotiates with the U.S. It's like 90 pages. Every person that deploys to Pakistan in any capacity must read this book because they nail Pakistan's behavior towards the Americans. The most important thing is that every time you meet someone from the armed forces, they know their brief. So when they come here to the NDU, they've all been basically censored by the ISI. There's usually an ISI langur in the room For those of you that know the Longoor reference, I'll just let you enjoy that. For those of you who don't, sorry, we'll explain it later. There's always an ISI minder in the room, making sure that people don't go off script. The only time you get them off script is when they're drunk and talking about the affairs they have. And every once in a while, when you're in Pakistan, you'll get to meet someone that hasn't been rigorously screened, and they'll say something off script. But for the most part, in my 20 years of going to Pakistan and interacting with folks in uniform, by the time they've met me or my colleagues, they have a pretty set thing that they're supposed to say. And so I personally do not prioritize those interview data very much, those interview data encounters very much, because they are really psychological operations opportunities. Instead, what I rely upon, and by the way, now this is no longer a reliable data source either, because they've also become part of the PSYOP, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I mostly almost exclusively rely upon Pakistan's own defense publications. These are publications that were not meant for me. These were publications that were meant for Pakistan's military personnel. They are meant to be a conversation for and among folks in uniform. Mostly these are men, of course, because there aren't that many women in the Pakistan Army. And so these are the sources of information that I primarily rely upon. And if they have any grouses about it, and I'll give you some examples of why they are very upset that some of this stuff has come to light, because they say things in these publications that are actually quite bizarre and even frightening for an army that so many people still call a professional army, even though it has conducted many coups and runs the government from behind the scenes, which are not typically things that we associate with a professional army. So let me talk about I'll just do kind of a laundry list of some of the key insights that I gathered from collecting decades of this material. And by the way, it took me over a decade to collect it. I've been collecting this stuff since about 2000. So this has been a labor of gray hair for quite some time. So this is not in any particular order. I'm not prioritizing it because so many of these themes overlap. It's sort of like a web. You pick on one of these themes and very quickly it bleeds into another. But the first is this idea that Pakistan's army defends the ideology as well as geography of the country. And they're very clear about this. I haven't heard the current army chief say this as of yet, but every other army chief I've tracked down making some statement to the effect that the two-nation theory is the ideology of Pakistan and it's our job to defend it. Now that's a very, if the Indian army chief were to say, it is our job to protect Hindutva, I guarantee you that there will be a lot of bovine defecation hitting the rotary oscillator, right? In most places, having an army chief make such an overtly ideological statement would really cause a lot of concern. But it's not. It's actually, it's just given. Everyone sort of accepts that this is the role of the Pakistan Army. If the American Army were to say this, holy cow, heads would roll. But a lot of people seem to think that this was something that Zia introduced. It's just not true. Ayub Khan did it. Ayub Khan in 1954 wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs where he talked, the title was something to the effect of the ideology of Pakistan. And he comes right out of the box talking about the founder of the two-nation theory. I seriously doubt that Ayub Khan wrote this article, but nonetheless his name is on it. And in his biography, Friends Not Masters, he has an entire chapter dedicated to the ideology of Pakistan. And so I think many Americans have this idea that if the army chief is a boozer and a womanizer, as many of them are, that somehow they're above instrumentalizing Islam. I mean, that was one of the big debates about Musharraf. He had his dogs, which I'm a dog lover, so that made an impression upon me. He liked his scotch and he liked his women. And therefore, we thought that because he was a cosmopolitan, secular-seeming person in his personal life, that he was above instrumentalizing Islam. And of course, he wasn't. It was his ISI that put together the MMA. Under his tenure, so many deals were cut with the TTP and so forth. So this idea goes back to the very first the first Pakistani army chief. And of course, the first army chief was British. Related to that is this idea, and this continues in their publications. Read Halal, read the most recent Pakistan Army Green Book that's available, that India is civilizationally Hindu. One of the more interesting articles I read from not the most recent Green Book, but the previous Green Book, was that Bollywood is a raw conspiracy meant to colonize Pakistanis with Hindu ideology. And the author was a very well-decorated senior Pakistani. In fact, the first 2/3 of the Green Books are written by flag officers. So these are not usually written by Joker Joes. But he was very upset that his children knew what bindis were and that his daughters were interested in wearing bindis, and therefore Bollywood was a raw conspiracy meant to promote India's Hindu ideology. So in other words, putting onto India the very project that Pakistan has embraced for itself, which is being an ideological state. And I can talk in the Q&A about how Modi is in some sense living, breathing incarnation of the Brahmanic part of the Brahmanic Talmudic Crusader alliance. And that's a separate discussion that I'm happy to engage in. But it's important in Pakistan's military literature to talk about India as Hindu, because that basically creates a civilizational conflict between the two countries. And civilizational conflicts are not resolved through policies, right? And not only is the army invested in making this argument within various reasons why it does this within its force, but it also wants to make sure that this concept diffuses out, because armies ultimately have to rely upon the support of their people. My brothers are military recruiters, and I worked on military manpower issues for many years, and I was at the Rund Corporation. For those of you who knows what that word means, that's an inside joke. But in any event, what you learn when you work on military recruitment is you're always talking about the recruiting market and how favorable it is. Like when my brother signs kids on the line, they're typically 16 years old, right? That's why we don't sign the Convention on Child Soldiering, because we recruit child soldiers. And the reason is by the time they turn 18, they don't need their parents' approval, they've gone on to other things. So we actually like that window in our military. So when my brother signs someone on the line at the age of 16, they're not selling the kid, they're selling the parent, right? So all militaries have this problem. If the society's values and norms move too far away from the military has difficulties manning and meeting the mission, and of course the country doesn't sustain support for what the military does, i.e. the last years of the Iraq War, where we currently are in Afghanistan. So the Pakistan Army has to always ensure that the distance, and sometimes it's imperfect, they're not magicians, right? So you saw distance emerging between the Pakistani people and Musharraf when Musharraf was in his later years, and so they have to do things like make the army chief leave. So it's not always happening in sync or in real time, but their large project is constantly making sure that their values as an organization are in some considerable measure embraced by the population. And I could talk to you about how they do that, but I think one of the key things is that Ayub Khan made a decision to align Pakistan's curriculum with its ideology. Again, many people blame Zia for this. It actually began with Ayub. And of course, when you have the military in direct control of the country, they can do things like Musharraf did, which is appoint the former ISI chief to be the Minister of Education, right? So this is a very good example of how explicitly the army is using its opportunity when it's directly in control of the country to take control of the civilian counterpart of this narrative. By making the claim, as it consistently does, that it has to defend the two-nation theory at all costs, relates to this other concept that if they let go of the two-nation theory, it's not a country worth presiding over. After all, if it's not a country that adheres to this two-nation theory, it's just a failed, sloppy version of India. Right? The other reason why the two-nation theory is so important is that ideologically, that's Pakistan's, what they think is their strongest claim to Kashmir. We can talk about why that's a problem. I would argue the two-nation theory failed when about 1/3 of the subcontinent's Muslims says, I'm actually staying here in India. And the second big nail was when they lost their own country, half of their country, because they were not respectful of the ethnic identity of Bengalis. And they're like, it's not enough to be a Muslim, we're Bengali, and we're getting out of here. So arguably losing half of your population and half of your territory, most of whom were Muslims, that should have been the second big old nail in that coffin. But that's how they manage the persistent belief in the two-nation theory is an interesting thing I'm very happy to talk about. As I talked about India, the army has to resist India's rise. And this, at first blush, this might seem sort of obvious. But when you really understand the implications of this, you understand why it is that Pakistan's always prepared to engage in some sort of military fiasco with India, even though it's not likely to prevail. And that's because Pakistan, the army doesn't view victory or defeat in the way that other militaries might, which is number of soldiers lost, numbers of POWs, loss of territory, either in terms of the quality or the quantity of the territory. It views defeat as acquiescence to India. And some years ago, when I was working on the Cargill conflict, which again, you give this game to any 14-year-old, let's play Cargill. The 14-year-old would have figured out, you know what, I think I'm just going to haul those jihadis right back to Lahore or wherever they're from, or Mansehra, but not the Pakistan Army. It went ahead. And so I asked an army chief, who will not be named, he's very frank about it. He said, we can't outright impose our will upon India conventionally. We can't do that. Nor can India at this point outright impose her will upon us conventionally. But if we do nothing and we accept the status quo, then we have accepted defeat. So he said, we will always prefer to take calculated risks because that's preferable to doing nothing. So in some sense, Pakistan is an international insurgent, right? An insurgent doesn't have to defeat the counterinsurgent. The counterinsurgent has to extirpate the insurgency to win, right? That's how most people would define a victory in a counterinsurgency. But the insurgent only has to preclude the counterinsurgent from exercising its will comprehensively whenever it wants. And that's how Pakistan views defeat or victory. And this comes across repeatedly in Pakistan's defense literature. In the book, I cite numerous examples. And what's interesting about this concept of jihad under an expanding nuclear umbrella is that Pakistanis begin formalizing it much earlier than I would say my peers in political science appreciate. Let's talk a little bit about where did this concept of jihad come from. Then we'll talk about the nuclear umbrella part. So I think we could make the case, because Shuja Nawaz already has, and Shuja Nawaz is the brother of a deceased army chief, Asif Nawaz, so I don't think anyone could call him a raw shill, certainly not a raw shill. He makes a very strong case that this was not non-state, that this was in fact state. So I agree with him that the 47-48 war was a state-led initiative. It began with provincial level support and eventually rose to the state of Pakistan itself. So this idea of non-state actors is something that's very early in the way in which the Pakistan Army approaches things. But you begin seeing this formalized in their defense literature in the 50s. And this is actually kind of ironic because we were training the Pakistanis to be our partners in counterinsurgencies after 1954 when we became allied through SEATO and CENTO. And why did we think this was important? Because Pakistan was supposed to go to our wars with us in Southeast Asia, because that's what SEATO stands for. As you all know, Pakistan didn't do that, even though it was an obligation. We talk about how Pakistan weaseled out of that, and unfortunately they never get any sort of heat for that. But nonetheless, that's why we were training them. We wanted them to be our partners in these engagements in Southeast Asia. And we were training them on counterinsurgency doctrine. But when you go and you read the Pakistan Army Journal from this period, these guys were doing something completely different. They were actually studying our enemies in Vietnam and in China, and they were making the conclusion, this is what you need to sustain an insurgency. And one of these articles I found had a whole checklist, and they said, well, I think we can do this. In areas, the Pakistanis are very funny. The Indians are the same way. They always talk about certain countries, third countries, certain hands, certain external forces, but you'd have to be a complete moron to not understand that the theater, the mountainous, forested terrain they were describing in this article was obviously Kashmir. And so throughout the 50s and 60s, the Pakistan defense literature is rife with these ideas of people's wars, that we need to have a standing people's army, that this is the way that we're going to defeat the Indians, because they understood even from the beginning. And I would say even more so in the beginning, because one of the things that Pakistan was really disadvantaged by was partition. When they say that India and when people say that they were equal inheritors of partition, it's utter rubbish. Pakistan was ripped off in every possible way. I mean, the Indians did everything they could to prevent Pakistan from getting what it was supposed to get under the terms of partition, and what it was supposed to get under the terms of partition itself was inadequate. So Pakistan was sort of like that symbiotic twin that was like sort of cut off at the shoulder, and everyone just sort of expected it to wither off and die, and surprisingly, it's managed to survive. So when people talk about it as a failed state, I actually think it's a miracle that Pakistan has managed to survive, even though there were no ministries of any consequences, huge personnel shortages, no history of governing this country from Karachi. All of the administrative infrastructure, militarily and civilian, was of course housed in India. So it's actually, when you think about what the military must have been thinking, about India at that point and the sort of pernicious effect of India's nickeling and diming Pakistan at every opportunity, and of course ousting the Auchinleck, who was Pakistan's only proponent in the partition process. You get some, when you go through the partition process, you can sort of understand how Pakistan military felt that it was never going to be accepted by India, and it continues for a variety of reasons to still bear the imprints of this partition process. You still find it in their defense writings. So ironically, they begin thinking about this non-state actor business under our tutelage. They become much more effective at it. And some of the articles that I cite were individuals who eventually were involved in the 65 war. So it's not the case that these are just random dudes writing silly things to get promoted. But these were actually people that were involved. I have a really great piece on infiltration by A.K. Niazi, who of course was the Pakistan Army commander who had to oversee the loss of East Pakistan. So many of the people that I cite in this book are actually pretty relevant in many of Pakistan's various wars. By the time you get to the 70s, it's no longer fashionable to talk about people's wars, and they begin using this jihad terminology. And then obviously they run with this. I want to point out that many people think that Pakistan began interfering in Afghanistan really under our tutelage, that we suck them into our jihad. And nothing makes me more angry when I see the Twitterati making this lame argument, because it's also just not true. Pakistan actually began very vigorously engaging itself in Afghanistan in the 50s and 60s when it inserted Jamaat Islami. Remember that many of the so-called Mujahideen had Jamaat Islami backgrounds. So we do a really interesting counterfactual. Had there been no Jamaat Islami inserted into Afghanistan, would there have been the same Mujahideen groups? For me, it's a counterfactual I always ask my students. The other counterfactual is, what would have happened if Charlie Wilson had actually gone to jail for all that cocaine he did in hot tubs with hookers? Another more fun counterfactual. My students like that one better. Let's talk a little bit about the expanding nuclear umbrella. A lot of misunderstanding, too, about that. Many people begin to think of Pakistan as a nuclear state circa 1990. Very bad misreading of that history. Does anyone know when we first sanctioned Pakistan for nuclear proliferation? Anyone just want to shoot out some random numbers? You should know.
91? 70.
You said
86.
who said 70? You're the closest. 1979. We in fact sanctioned them April of 1979. And this was under Carter. So when Pakistan say we suck them into their jihad, you're like, really? If we were sucking you into a jihad, we were really stupid about it, because we sanctioned you in April of 79, which made sucking you into our jihad very difficult, because that made security assistance impossible without a waiver. So we actually sanctioned them in April of 79, which meant that in April of 79, we had enough evidence and belief that they had crossed key thresholds that we thought they were well on their way to acquiring a nuclear weapon. So when people say sanctions don't work, they don't know how the sanctions went. We relieved the sanctions, right? Brzezinski said when the Russians crossed the Amudarya, we have to let go of this because we have to deal with the Russians. Now, when you go back and you read Pakistan's defense literature, they actually are thinking of themselves as a nuclear capable state far earlier than 1990, when, of course, the Prosser Amendment sanctions basically put back into effect the sanctions that had been waived from April of 79. And they talk about this concept of nuclear overhang. They say that it's not what we have that matters, it's what the Indians think we may have that matters most. And so the exercise I'd like to do at some point, not in the near future, because I've got other projects that are ongoing, is do the countervailing study, looking at India's defense literature to see how did Indians see this. But there is evidence in Pakistan's conflicts in the 80s that the Indians did think of them as a potential nuclear state. We now know from Feroz Khan's book, Smoking Grass, that Pakistan had a large enough weapon, a crude weapon that could be shoved off the back of a transport aircraft in extremis. And Abdus Sattar, in his book, makes a similar claim about the timeline. This is also interesting because if you look at the history of Pakistan's nuclear program, actually it's Zulfikar Ali Bhutto that started it. And he was actually quite prescient. He wanted to pursue a nuclear weapons program at 1964. And what you have to understand between India and Pakistan's nuclear weapons program is that India's program was actually started by the British. So some of India's founding nuclear scientists studied with, for example, Charles Bohr. Anyone had to do the Bohr model of the atom in college? I did. I was a chemist. So for me, that's a little bit traumatic. But anyways, so the Indian program began before independence. The Pakistan program really didn't start until much, much later, and really under the get up and go that was given to it by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. His logic in 64 was spot on. He said the Indians lost to China in the 1962 war. The Chinese tested at Lop Nor in 64, and that's how they sort of snuck in to the nuclear umbrella and became part of the Permanent Five, or what India would call the permanent nuclear apartheid. In 64, he says to Ayub Khan, I think we need to have a nuclear weapons program. And Ayub said, are you crazy? It'll piss off all of our allies. We'll just buy one off the shelf if we need one. From the defense literature, it looks as if the military was more of the opinion that they should pursue this program as opposed to not pursuing it. But in any event, it's a moot point because it didn't really get going until the loss of East Pakistan and the total beating up of the army, and then Zulfikar coming in and taking over. And he writes in his biography, If I'm Assassinated, and of course he was assassinated, that when Zia took over, they were just a few years from producing a bomb. And so for many years, people thought that was just a bunch of rubbish. But we now know, in fact, that he was actually quite true. He was speaking truthfully. It wasn't nonsense. And he also accused the CIA for supporting the coup because we wanted to preempt Pakistan from getting this weapon. So what you see when you go to the Pakistan defense literature is that they're thinking of themselves as having a nuclear capability long before 1990. And I actually present in the book, I think it's chapter 7 or 8, quantitative data that supports this. You can see numerically that from about 1979 to 1980, Pakistan begins taking breathless risks. In the 1980s, they are at the same time running the insurgency, obviously with American support at this point in Afghanistan. They are starting pretty aggressive actions in Kashmir, but they're also deeply involved in India's insurgency in the Punjab and the sustained low levels activity in India's northeast. So this is from when you sort of map out the progress of Pakistan's nuclear umbrella unfolding, you see Pakistan's adventurism expanding. So this is important because this didn't happen in 1990. It didn't happen because of a failure of U.S. sanction. It happened because we switched priorities. I think this is important to the people that say, but sanctions didn't work. It didn't work because we gave them no chance. Sanctions were imposed in April of 79, and as soon as Reagan came in, he began working to undo those sanctions. So another really interesting counterfactual is if we hadn't made that priority change, would we be in the same position as we are today with Pakistan? So those are some of the key findings that kind of emerge from this reading of their literature. Let me just say very briefly, one has to go through the exercise of saying, well, the past isn't always the best predictor of the future, right? Is there something that can change? Now, having spent years doing military manpower, military strategic cultures, they're very slow to evolve, but they do evolve. Like I remember the very first fight that I had with my brother was in 1993 when the first discussion of letting gays in the military came in. And of course I was a proponent of it because I'm a liberal with a nose ring, and my brother was in uniform. He's like, I don't want dudes looking at me naked in the shower. I'm like, so in other words, you don't want to be objectified. Oh boy, I understand that. Yeah, that really sucks. I feel your pain, I really do, bro. Huge argument. We didn't speak to each other for 2 weeks. My brother now is the biggest proponent of gays in the military, right? Why is that? Because he wants folks in boots. He was so furious when we ousted the gay Arabic linguists because it turns out, for whatever reason, a bunch of our linguists were gay. And my brother's like, what are they doing? So that was 1993, and we're now at 2014, right? And my brother's enlisted. He's not an officer, and I hang out with many of his enlisted colleagues. They are more like him today. They're not on the same page as him entirely, because I think my brother's actually pretty cool, and some of his colleagues are still kind of, mouth breathing. But nonetheless, they're more like him today than they are like him in 1993. And then think about, we're now considering women in combat roles, right? So militaries change as society change. So and in fact, one of the things that I found was most interesting, the biggest positive surprise, is that I had these district level officer recruitment data. And one of the things the Pakistan Army has been very successful at doing, and what I'm gonna say might sound anti-army, but I don't mean it to be. When you're an army that runs the country, and by runs the country, I also mean ruins the country, and loots the country, right? Because there's a huge institutional value that the military gets when it has complete control over key levers of the state. And you only have two ethnic groups Punjabis and then less so Pashtuns that are perceived to be as a part of this condominium that loots, runs, and ruins the country. It causes grievances, right? So the grievances in Balochistan and Sindh, the Baloch and the Sindhis have historically been very unrepresented in the military. Now, the reasons for this are both supply side and demand side, right? The Baloch and the Sindhis don't necessarily want to join. That was also the problem with East Pakistan. And it's also a problem, so it's a supply from that point of view, that the Baloch and the Sindhis don't really want to join. There's also a demand constraint because the military has criteria that you have to meet to get into the officer corps and also the enlisted. And this is a sort of a nested vicious cycle, that the human capital that exists in Balochistan and Sindh make it on average less likely that any Baloch or Sindhi is going to meet those criteria. So what the Pakistan Army has done in its effort to expand to other districts in Balochistan and Sindh is that it has, at different points in time, relaxed those recruitment standards. Now, this is actually really interesting for an army that's perpetually on some kind of war footing with India. Because what this means is, since that you have, depending on what data source you look at, for every one slot at the Pakistan military in Kakul, anywhere between 100 and 1,000 applicants. So in other words, the Pakistan Army can pick the best of the litter. And what it's choosing to do in many instances is pick a lesser qualified person from Balochistan or Sindh at the expense of a much more qualified Punjabi or Pashtun. Now that is a very puzzling institutional choice. And it turns out it's deliberate, right? So they're building cadet colleges in Sindh and Balochistan. And there's even evidence that the people they're recruiting from Sindh and Balochistan are in fact Baloch and Sindhis as opposed to just Punjabis. Because you could imagine they're just recruiting Punjabis from Sindh and saying that we're recruiting from Sindh, but they're really Punjabis. But there's evidence that they're actually recruiting the ethnic groups of those provinces. So why is this really interesting? So some of you know that I do a lot of large N data on Pakistan. So at the time of writing this book, I had a data set that was over 16,000 people. It turns out that the districts, these new districts from which they're recruiting, are far less likely to support this jihadi nonsense. They have very different views about civil military control. They have a very different set of views about political Islam. In some cases, the people are less likely to like jihad, but they're more likely to support military interventions. I mean, in other words, it's very uneven. But the point is, by virtue of them reaching into these new districts, they have an interesting puzzle on their hands because they're not recruiting the people from the same districts in the Punjab that are much more aligned to these ideological commitments that I laid out. So this means one of two things. It means that over time, the Pakistan Army is going to evolve in ways that are different in kind of the same ways that I laid out about the American military, going from the recruitment of African Americans to putting women in combat roles. Militaries do this. So it's entirely possible that over 1-2 more decades, that the values of the Pakistan Army Corps will change. That's entirely possible. But for those of you with military backgrounds, you also know that militaries are very good sausage makers, right? And we don't know anything about the recruitment or the retention of these people, right? It may be that they got into the officer corps, but they don't promote and they attrit out more so than folks in the Punjab. But when I go through these different scenarios that are both internal and external to Pakistan, this to me is the one that has the most promise because it means that the Pakistan Army can't really there is no such thing as a free lunch, right? They can go into these new districts to make their project of running the country look more representative. But their task then of homogenizing these worldviews to be more consistent with the kinds of things that I laid out actually becomes much, much harder. So I will shut up. I talked too much, I think.
No, you'll continue to talk.
Okay.
Because you'll answer questions.
All right.
And I think with a number of provocative statements that Chris has characteristically made, there ought to be quite a few questions. If you'll wait for the microphone and take the guy in the corner, and if you wouldn't mind just mentioning your name and where you're from.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Iftikhar Hussain. I work for Voice of America.
You said Khalid Hussain?
Iftikhar Hussain.
Iftikhar Hussain. Okay.
Yeah. I work for Voice of America, Pashto to the border region. It's a 9 hours of broadcast. Our broadcast is called Live Radio. Before question, I'm the son of a military person from Pakistan, and I'm a Pashtun. For 9 years, he had a treatment. My father died in 2008. He did not go to a civilian doctor. He did not trust him. That, though I often mocked his victories in his 2 wars, the 65-71, he used to tell me when I was a kid. My question is how much the Pakistan military now trusts the civilian institutions. There is you have been through a lot of military literature from Pakistan. So the bloody civilians, you might remember that term. So the question is how much
it's
they...
branded in my brain, the bloody civilians. Shut up, bloody civilian.
Yes, that symbolizes their trust on the civilian
Yes.
institutions. Yeah.
No, so look, you're absolutely right. One of the core beliefs of the Pakistan Army, and I should have emphasized this more in my opening remarks, that it is the only institution that can protect Pakistan's geography and ideology. And so in both of those cases, the bloody civilians are the enemy. And the bloody civilians can be the enemy in the sense that they are corrupt, that they're venal, that they're soft on India. I mean, the permutations of bloody India, of bloody civilians are maybe I could count 9 or 10 versions of the bloody civilians. And what I find really frustrating, I do a lot of survey work, that trope of the bloody civilians, and by bloody, y'all know, it doesn't mean like zombie civilians, it means like, effing civilians. It's truly, it is. It's not a nice word. So in any event, what I find very frustrating is that the trope of the bloody civilian has very wide acceptance among Pakistanis. And I wrote this piece called The Army's New Playbook, which, by the way, has a lot of, this is what we're seeing now is kind of a redux of what we saw in the spring of 2013 when the Army was trying to prematurely bring down the Zardari government. But it has a regrettable resonance among many Pakistanis. So sort of the Army's old playbook was that the Army, and the civilians, by the way, I don't want you to leave here thinking the Army is the only problem that Pakistan has. The Army cannot do a coup without completely co-opted civilian elements in every part of Pakistan's institution. It really takes a village to run a country and to ruin it. So the playbook kind of goes like this. You'll have parties that are fighting. The opposition party doesn't want to wait for this thing called elections. And so they engage in various hijinks like long marches, sit-ins, organizing public protests that become unmanageable, putting kids in madrasas on buses and shipping them around to engage in hooliganism. And then the Army, of course, just has to step in because these incompetent bloody civilians are so terrible. So the Army chief steps in. What's the first thing that happens? So the Supreme Court, right? The Supreme Court takes an oath to uphold the Constitution. And what are they doing? The dudes with any integrity, of course, they resign. The ones who don't resign. By the way, Chowdhury, he took, I think, was it 2 or 3 oaths to Musharraf's various PCOs before he decided that he was going to become the fighter for democracy. So Chowdhury was a deeply compromised individual despite his fame towards the end for being a big opposition to the military. So the dudes with integrity resign, fine. The Army just puts in new chief justices who then take an oath to his provisional constitutional order. This is important because those justices then become part of the Independent Election Commission that oversees the invariably flawed, massively rigged elections. Elections don't take place until the ISI can carve together an opposition of choice. Usually it's an opposition with a bunch of Islamists in it. And then the elections are held. And because they're rigged, the Islamists do much better than they do during free elections. And then this kangaroo parliament's formed, and they turn into law these PCOs. They basically, rape and pillage the Constitution by putting in these extrajudicial orders offered by the president into the Constitution. And people go along with this because, again, the bloody civilians were so terrible. And they go along with this until they don't go along with it, in which case the Army has to, again, re-optimize, and they bring in, through different means, a form of controlled democracy. So you're absolutely right about this idea. And this is what I say to the politicians. You're a part of this. The politicians love to blame the Army for democracy interruptus, but there would be no party sitting in the parliament during this phase of a kangaroo parliament if it weren't for corrupt, inept politicians from the pre-existing parties that then get cobbled together into, most recently, for example, the PMLQ. So I don't want you to leave here thinking that I'm like an army basher, because this whole process of coup formation involves the complete complicity of every single branch of Pakistan's civilian government. But going to your point that you made, I think it's important that everyone understand this. Why does the Pakistan Army want to expand its recruitment into Balochistan and Sindh and elsewhere? Because if the Army is a womb-to-tomb welfare organization, not only for the officers, also for the enlisted. They have their own schools, they have their own hospitals. It is amazing that just because you are an Army chief, you get to go to Dubai or London for healthcare. Yet Pakistanis think that this is a perquisite that they're entitled to. I mean, I think it's just outrageous. So this speaks to the degree to which this narrative of the army and the bloody civilians has just seeped into the soil of Pakistan. And I don't know how you fix that. So in my book, I'm not terribly optimistic that we get out of this, but that's a different.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that great question.
We have a question from the overflow room. How much economic stake does the Army have, and are their economic interests dominated by the Punjabi Army only?
All right, so this is a really good question. I think you guys know that the Army has both organizations that have direct business interests, and then they also have these foundations. Information, what I love about the Pakistan Army, they say that they run a clean government, but we don't actually know because information about their businesses are not available. So the Fauji Foundation makes everything from cornflakes to concrete, but we know nothing about their business statistics. We know nothing. It's just as classified as their nuclear program. And I'm not really being facetious, because and the only person that's been able to develop any information on this is Aisha Siddiqa in her book Military Inc. She's made a very heroic effort, but at the end she only has data on something like 4 firms. So she's written a book about data on fewer than 10 firms. So this is really huge. And when you try to get an idea of what their economic stakes are, because you can sort of think about like a Chilean, how do you buy out the generals, right? I think it's really hard to buy out the generals because they own just about everything they want to own. And the other thing that they're very good at is that when they are running the country, they have patronage networks that support them. And these patronage networks they're not stupid, because those patronage networks also have patronage relations with civilians. And this means that for the people that are beneficiaries of the military government, they're also beneficiaries of a civilian government. And so the only way you create institutionally opposition to one of these kinds of regimes is if you have a large set of people that are kind of outed by the whole system. They're not benefiting. But over time, with every military intervention, the patronage network that they develop, i.e. the people that are vested in this military regime, continue to expand. So, which is why you don't really see, it's not like the Bazaris in Iran, where they are so important. You have to constantly make sure that the Bazaris are on track. And I would argue the difference is that in Pakistan, the business elites are so thoroughly imbricated into this military and civilian structure that you don't have this surge of opposition to either.
We're going to have time for only 2 more questions, so maybe we can take them both at the same time. Right here, and right here.
Hi, my name is Aman Sharif. I have lots of questions, but I'm just going to ask one.
Thank you.
As these operations in North Waziristan and whatnot over the years have been happening, do you see any impact of these soldiers rising up through the ranks over the years affecting how the Pakistan Army's thinking changes in general towards India, towards Afghanistan, whatever?
Right.
And then,
Hi, my name's Simon Henderson. Thanks. I've got a copy of your book already, but I haven't read it other than finding my own name in it. Did you form a judgment on whether the Pakistan Army thinks it can win a nuclear war against India? And if you did, what is it? Thank you.
All right, so let me take this first one, because it's actually, that's a tougher one. This one's actually, your question is much more interesting. So let's talk a little bit what these operations are and what these operations aren't. These operations are not to actually go and eliminate terrorism, right? What these operations are, this particular one's a really good example. They gave the terrorists 5 months warning. So any terrorist worth his knockoff Chinese sneakers is already absconded. The goal of this was to take those commanders so when the Pakistan Army talks about negotiations with the TTP, what they really mean is, can we persuade you through threat of death or large amounts of money to stop driving your vehicle-borne IEDs and so forth against us? And can you maybe go kill some Americans or some Afghans in Afghanistan? And the timing, for example, of the so-called ceasefire, boy, it was a coincidence that it was just the same time as the Afghan election cycle. Boy, how did that happen? I wonder. So now what are they trying to do? So, they've got all the terrorists of any consequences that could be flipped have flipped. So the dudes that remain are the ones that are not flippable and actually want to fight the Pakistanis, and they're being eliminated. They're being eliminated at a very high price. By the way, where's Operation Code Pink? Over the 1 million Pashtuns are being displaced. You didn't see Pashtuns being displaced with the drone program. That's another pet peeve of mine, Code Pink. But how is the Army managing this? Your question is really interesting. So before circa 2000, well, I would say until maybe the last 5 years, a unit would suffer the first unit death because of India, right? Maybe in Siachen, probably due to exposure, but that they can still call that India. Or maybe in some shenanigan along the ceasefire line. But your first unit death for much of Pakistan's history, you could attribute it to an Indian. All right, so your question is really interesting. One thing I did notice when I still went to Pakistan is that the fellows that had not gone to FATA, not FATA, some people call them FATA, they would call them miscreants. When you meet someone that has fought in FATA, they're now terrorists. So the Pakistan, this is just real. To a person, before they go to FATA, they're miscreants. But when they go, they're terrorists. And so think about this from an institutional point of view. At the level of strategy, GHQ and the ISI views the Afghan Taliban as a partner. Parts of the TTP are partners, right? So you would have no TTP if you didn't have these Deobandi militant groups that were at some point or another part of Pakistan's strategy to manage India. But from the fellow on the ground getting shot at, what's happening, the high politics of GHQ is irrelevant because you have just been shot at. You have lost friends. And so there's this, and you're not losing your friends because of an Indian. You're losing your friends because of a Pakistani. Now, how do they manage this rhetorically? This is very interesting. Did you guys see the picture of 1 billion Indian rupees? I'm not kidding. 1 billion Indian rupees recovered in North Waziristan. The picture of the 1 billion Indian rupees was about 50,000 rupees. And of course, ISI manufactures Indian rupees as a part of its economic espionage. So the Pakistanis also talk about these uncircumcised blokes running around. They do everything, of course, just so you know, Masouds and FATA don't circumcise. And if you want evidence of that, I can introduce you to some Masouds from FATA, and they can show you that they are in fact in accordance with that stated tradition. So the Pakistanis have done a lot to make this look like the intervention, the militarism and the terrorism in FATA is due to Indians. Have you? I know I'm going to. The exact title is "Khuda is zameen se ab tak nahi gaya." The translation is "God hasn't left us. God hasn't left this soil." But the exact title, I think I butchered. The opening scene, and actually I tried to make my South Asia class watch it, and like so many Pakistanis in Indian DVDs, it choked. But the opening scene is a fellow who looks an awful lot like Naik Mohammed, one of the hottest jihadis I've ever seen. And he's having a conversation with a funder, and he's complaining, why did you give that other commander more money? We're the real people doing real work. And what was the implication of that scene, right? That these are men, they're taking money from the outside. Outside could be CIA, it could be RAW, it could be Mossad, it could be the Kangaroo Man, who cares? It's not a Pakistani that's funding this. And so this is how I think the Pakistan Army invests so much in this idea that the Indians are behind this, because this idea that Pakistanis are killing Pakistanis is a very troubling thought. And so that's one way in which they're managing it. But obviously they can't manage it. So I think 10 years from now, by the way, I'm going to go another point. They've been killing Baloch for decades, right? And no one has cared. But there's a difference about Balochistan. Baloch are about 5% of the population, 60% of the territory, and they're secular, right? And the Indian connection with Balochistan is much more enduring, and it's an easier argument to make. It's hard to make an argument that the Indians are backing Islamists and Fatah when many of those elements are groups that have killed Indians. So one shouldn't think that they can't kill Pakistanis, because they do. Balochistan, they're perfectly happy to slaughter as many Baloch as they want to with impunity, and there is no backlash. But Pashtuns are different for the reasons that I noticed. They are overrepresented in the Pakistan army based upon current data than the Punjabis are. So what Pashtuns think might be a little bit more important going forward than what Punjabis think. Going to your question, sir, about do they think they can win a nuclear war? They don't talk like this, right? They don't say we will prevail. Their argument's a little bit different. Most of their arguments is about deterrence and compellence, right? That we have and they're not probably just compelling Indians. That's what's another really important thing that Americans need to understand. Their weapons are about compelling us. So when India and Pakistan are going at it, usually because there's a Pakistani terrorist that's blown up something in India. And Wendy, you saw this. What how do we handle this? I mean, now Blackwell was a little bit of an odd sort, because Blackwell was basically saying, go for it, go to war. Other parts of the U.S. government said to India, calm down, de-escalate, because we don't want the Pakistanis to move west to east. So with the exception of that lunatic Blackwell, and that's record, he's a lunatic. That's a twit that if you want. Chris Fair called him a lunatic. He's a lunatic. Stand by it. With the exception of that lunatic, generally our approach has been to give India a way of de-escalating. Go to Pakistan make some statements, maybe they'll even decrease infiltration for a while, give India some space where it can retreat. So we are part of shielding Pakistan from bearing the consequences of its own action. The other way they compel us is that people who follow the nuclear issue are not so concerned about the Islamic barbarian at the nuclear gate, because if the Islamo-fascists can get the nukes, so can Ra, so can Mossad, so could we, right? So if you think about Pakistan's command and control in their security apparatus, in terms of undesirable infiltration, their interests and ours are pretty much in alignment. But the problem is when they go to conflict with India, that's when the things they're obviously assembled, they're probably already assembled, and then they're mated to their delivery device, and they're forward deployed. And that's when the stuff becomes amenable to theft. And the Pakistanis know we know this. So that puts us in a place where we are incentivized to intervene in a conflict ever more quickly. And so not only is there constant discussion of tactical nuclear weapons designed to deter India, and whatever Modi will do with resuscitating Cold Start, I think he's going to do something along those lines. Not only is it about deterring them, it's about deterring us. Because with congressional interest and American interest in cutting them off, the Pakistanis are very worried about this. So how do they keep us there with our checkbook and our big embassy? Is by constantly reminding us of how scary they are with their nuclear weapons, and they're too dangerous to fail. So they don't talk about it, can we beat the Indians? They talk about it as a tool of coercion.
Lots more to read in the book. Thank you very much, Chris, and if you can...
Great.